You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 14th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Can Ukraine make peace without Russia in Switzerland? Do the Italians still welcome the Americans at a naval base in Sicily? And can you name the big French film festival that is not in Cannes? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. It is Friday's in-house daily, and we have a travelling carousel of Monocle editors and contributors who have been scouring Europe's events this week for news and entertainment. My guests are Andrew Muller, Julia Lasica, Alexis Self, and Gunnar Grunled. We'll be hearing also from a photographer of bars, the drinking kind, not the prison kind, at Art Basel in Switzerland. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Chris Chermak. On Saturday, Lucerne in Switzerland will host a peace summit for Ukraine that's taking place very much in a time of war, with both sides still hunkering down in their trenches and key country leaders deciding not to participate in this summit, most notably Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. The onus is very much on Ukraine and Switzerland to make the most of this gathering. Well, I'm joined now by Andrew Muller, Monocle contributor and host of the Foreign Desk, and by Monocle researcher Julia Lasica. Andrew, you are about to go to this little shindig, which is indeed why I am hosting the Daily in your place. But before you go, what are you expecting?
I'm honestly not sure what to expect, Chris. I think, like quite a lot of people, there's a certain amount of uncertainty, that is, in my own head about quite what we're all going to be doing here. I think everybody who is attending broadly thinks about the situation the same way and has broadly thought about the situation the same way for a little over 2 years now. It's just not clear to me how having one more summit to reiterate how much all the attendees agree with each other about this is going to move anything along.
Well, Julia, to that point, I mean, Russia was, of course, never going to really attend this summit, so it isn't really about negotiating a peace deal. Volodymyr Zelensky is, of course, there. What do you think is his goal, then, to Andrew's point? What will he see as a success?
So I think that the original idea, really, for the summit was to create a coalition across the world, spanning continents, of countries who would be able to agree on one peace plan. Why would they need to agree on one peace plan? Because since 2022 and before, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, lots of different peace plans have been floated and have even been signed, like the Minsk agreement. Lots of them have involved proposed, Ukraine giving up territory, freezing a line between Ukraine and Russia, lots of things that do not play in Ukraine's favour at all, and from the Ukrainian perspective, just elongates the war. So this was about creating this coalition. There are lots of countries that still need to be won over. In South America, there are many, many countries, for example, notably Brazil, that are very much pro-Russian in their views of how peace will be achieved. So this was about creating that coalition, and then with this international coalition forcing Russia through pressure internationally to accept peace on Ukrainian terms, which would create a lasting peace. Obviously, this has encountered many problems.
Well, it has encountered certainly problems, and to the point of expanding that coalition, Andrew, Volodymyr Zelensky has been traveling. He has been trying to court various different countries. He was in Asia as well. What do you expect him to do with this summit? Do you expect him to change his pitch at all, as it were, that he's been making for the last 2.5 years to try and have a kind of different impact and expand that coalition?
Well, this is what I'm curious to see, and I do say this with absolutely every sympathy for President Zelensky and for Ukraine, in that the case he has been making for a little over 2 years now is completely unarguable, which is that Ukraine was was attacked without provocation for no good reason whatsoever by a Russia which is in the grip of some flight of, revanchist imperial fantasy. There's only so many times, though, that I think you can say the same thing over and over again, which is the way that this ends is that Russia packs up and pushes off, by which we mean pushes off to its 1991 borders. Ukraine was never any threat whatsoever to Russia. Nobody and nothing in Western Europe is any threat whatsoever to Russia. Certainly if I was Vladimir Putin, that is not the border I would be worrying about. But he can only say this so many times and in so many ways. And one of his great strengths has always been that he is by inclination and by profession a showman, and that is not said pejoratively at all. It's a statement of fact. He understands the media. He would have understood 2.5 years ago that the clock is ticking on this. People's attention will waver. There will be, as there have been, other crises. I think if there is anything in this for him, I think the timing may be significant. I would be fascinated to know if he thought there will be those EU elections. They may be disruptive. It would be good to get everybody in one room as soon as possible after that and let's all remind ourselves which side we're supposed to be on. If it accomplishes that, then it has accomplished something. But I will be very, very interested to see what his message is.
Do we imagine, Julia, then, that Russia is in any way worried about this summit? They have been trying to make life difficult through this summit, cyber attacks, insulting Switzerland's president for that matter. I mean, does that suggest that they do see this as something that could galvanize support in maybe a different way than the past?
Yes, I think anything that Ukraine does as an independent sovereign nation where it is building diplomatic connections with the rest of the world, that scares him. Of course it does. But I think also, there is a feeling of confidence, unfortunately, also, but from the Russian side, they're increasingly brazen in their sabotage attacks across Europe, across the world, targeting support for Ukraine, targeting European unity, global unity. So I think that these attacks also on the Swiss president and on the Swiss nation at this time are also just a sort of middle finger at, an attempt to bring people together. I think that's the mixture we're looking at.
And Andrew, even if some of the big names are staying away, aside from Volodymyr Zelensky, is there somebody that you're either hoping to meet or particularly curious to listen to and see what kind of role they're going to play in this?
There's lots of people I'm hoping to meet, and I have been doing that somewhat surreal feeling thing with which I know you're familiar, Chris, of sort of breezily firing off emails to presidents and prime ministers and saying, would you have 15 minutes this weekend? Weirdly, a couple of people have replied saying, yeah, maybe. So you never know. But I will be most curious, I think, to see what the dynamic is like between President Emmanuel Macron of France and Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany, both of whom are going, both of whom did get roughed up somewhat in those EU parliamentary elections, and both of whom, though this is a whole other show, have responded to that challenge in vastly different ways. I do rather expect that in the absence of President Biden, though Kamala Harris is going, Macron will place himself, and frankly not unreasonably, at centre stage and position himself as the sheriff in town. Also will be interesting to see how Giorgia Meloni conducts herself, the Prime Minister of Italy. She obviously is one of the EU leaders who has not been plunged into flights of despair by the EU elections because she is of that far-right ilk, which has had a bit of an upsurge, but to the surprise of many, ever since she actually became Prime Minister, she has been pretty rock solid where Ukraine has been concerned. So that'll be interesting as well.
Julia, just finally, same question. Is there any particular country that you have your eye on that perhaps is for turning, I suppose, or convincing to be more supportive of Ukraine?
Actually, interestingly, Switzerland, because Switzerland has remained very neutral in this. And it's really interesting to see them hosting this conference because, it could have been France, it could have been Germany, could have been wanting to kind of rebuild its image in Ukraine, which has taken a real serious battering. But it's actually interesting that it's Switzerland. And it's also very interesting to see that they have been assaulted by these Russian attacks. And will this really change the way they see Russia now that they've got this taste of Russian medicine?
Andrew Muller and Julia Lassica, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Daily. This is The Daily on Monocle Radio. We head to Catania in eastern Sicily now, where Monocle's foreign editor Alexis Self has been trying to do some important Monocle-type things, but having some parking issues from what I hear about it. In the meantime, Lex, what has been happening with the parking, and more importantly, why are you there?
Buonasera, Chris. So I'm sure I don't need to tell most of our listeners that Sicily and the whole of Italy has a bit of a reputation, especially in its cities, for narrow streets and shall we say, rambunctious driving. My photographer, or rather the photographer who's on the assignment with me, who's a long-time Monocle contributor called Benjamin McMahon, uttered a line which I think encapsulates the driving mood in Catania, which was, we've all heard these people drive like maniacs. Ben said, these people park like maniacs. The driving like maniacs goes without saying. People park wherever they want to, which is difficult when you're trying to get down a street. So I'm already quite intimate with central Catania, having only been here for an hour because I've gone round and round and round about 4 or 5 times.
I'm very glad to hear that. I mean, it must be a wonderful place to drive through the streets being frustrated out of your mind about parking issues. But do tell us why you actually are there as well.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily frustrated, but yes, let's get down to business. I'm here to report 2 stories for Monocle Mediterraneo, which is our summer newspaper. One of them, which I reported yesterday, was on albergo diffusi, which means scattered hotels in Italian. And this is a movement that began in the 80s and partly as a way of addressing an issue that lots of small Italian towns and villages have of depopulation and emigration, which leads to depopulation. And as a result of those 2 things, there's lots of abandoned buildings in towns and villages up and down the peninsula and the islands. So as part of a way to address that and kind of turn these abandoned buildings into something, this albergo diffusi movement grew and in this part of Sicily especially has kind of taken hold. And so yesterday we visited 2, one in a place called Vizzini and another in Ragusa. So people stay in rooms in the village, but they're scattered around the place, and the reception is in one building, and then there's rooms scattered around. It's a very nice place way to kind of experience a town and a village like a local. I sort of thought of it actually as a way, obviously the big movement at the moment in hospitality, or past decade or so, has been with Airbnb and private rentals. It kind of meets private rentals and hotels both ways. You have the service and the kind of attentiveness of a hotel, of a conventional hotel, but the more kind of local, scattered feeling of a private rental. So we did that yesterday. Today we've been on Nas Sigonella, which is a huge joint Italian and US air base, sort of nestled at the foot of Mount Etna, which is the huge volcano which towers over this part of the island, and it's actually Europe's most active volcano, and I think the largest. So we've been there today. They've got a big anniversary celebration tomorrow, which is the 65th anniversary of the base. So there's going to be celebrations, parades, etc. tomorrow, which we'll be going to. But today we had a tour of the base. We met, a few of the thousands of personnel who are based there.
And so tell us a little more about this historic airbase, 65th anniversary, as you say, that you've gotten the tour of. I do wonder how it is viewed by the Sicilians themselves. Americans, well, let's say, are not always welcomed when it comes to sort of being stationed overseas. How is this base viewed by the Sicilians? And full disclosure, before you answer that, my grandfather is Sicilian. I'm just going to throw that out there, Italian-American. But how are the Americans viewed in Sicily?
So I think when the Americans first moved to Sigonella, because it had been an Italian airstrip for a few decades before. So when the Americans move in, and it's the American naval air forces, so the air forces and that support the 6th Fleet of the US Navy, which is mostly based in Naples, a huge naval base just south of Naples. So Sigonella is the kind of surveillance, information gathering support for the US Sixth Fleet. I think when the base began or started, or when Americans started arriving there in 1959, there are similarities to the present day in that, the geopolitical situation in the Mediterranean and in Europe was heating up. And so, the debate back then was about, whether the US could base nuclear arms at European bases, and it was a very controversial issue. And, it's ebbed and flowed since then. Obviously, after the Cold War, those kinds of bases became less important, or rather, probably operationally less active. And we're seeing, now in the past few years, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and obviously the situation in the Middle East, I think that these types of bases are becoming more active. Whenever I try to ask some of my interlocutors whether operationally things were heating up or becoming more busy, they politely told me that they couldn't say. But my understanding is that, in recent years, certainly Sigonella has been supporting US naval ships who are, and aircraft who are kind of monitoring the situation in the Black Sea, the situation in the Red Sea at the moment, and East Africa and the Horn of Africa. So sorry, I digressed a bit from your question. The view of the base, I think, in Sicily was favourable at the beginning, but actually since there's been a few incidents where the Americans have had to stand down, and there was a famous one in the 80s when a hijacked aircraft that had PLO, Palestinian terrorists on it, who had killed an American citizen on a hijacked ship, and the Americans were trying to get them to land to arrest them. And the Italians interjected and said, well, this is our jurisdiction, you can't arrest them here. And actually Reagan had to tell the US naval forces to stand down in that instance, because the Italians, there's a bit of that. There's been a few instances in the past of kind of arguments over who has jurisdiction where. It's a huge US presence there. There's around 6,000 US personnel and their families who are based there. So the view, and again, the people that I was talking to seem to kind of disclose that since the war on terror began in the early 2000s, again, the view of these bases has changed somewhat. There have been protests. There were quite large protests at Sigonella against the war in Iraq in the early 2000s. And then most recently, there's been protests regarding the situation in Gaza and more generally US support for Israel. So I think at the moment, relations are very cordial between the governments of the US and Italy, and between the two armed forces. But I think perhaps the view of ordinary Sicilians, if I can speak to that, is that the base is slightly more controversial presence now than it was, for example, 20 or 30 or even 65 years ago.
So many different conflicts to attract protests between the US and Italians. Alexis Self, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Chris Chermak. If you think about French film festivals, the one that probably comes to mind is Cannes, but that is hardly the only celebration of film in the country. The world's biggest international film festival for animation is held every year in the postcard scenic town of Annecy in the southeast of France. This year's edition ends tomorrow, but Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid dropped by the festival earlier this week and joins me now right here in studio. Good evening, Gunnar.
Good evening.
So this is a pretty massive, actually, festival when you look at the numbers. 16,000 people, 102 countries attending. It's not really that known, I suppose. As I say, Cannes is the one that always sort of draws the headlines. What did you find out about kind of the state of the animation world?
Yeah, I mean, this particular festival comes at a really precarious time, really, in the animation industry. It was a very exciting time because there's so many new players. So many countries from all around the world are a part of this festival this year. But also, we're seeing the biggest industry layoffs in many, many years, and the new sort of tech disruptor of artificial intelligence, which a lot of people are concerned about.
Did you get any sense as to why it's doing so badly at this point? I know we're going to play a few clips, but what was your feeling as to why animation is struggling at the moment?
Part of what people pointed to is that because of the pandemic and the rise of streaming, now finally all these studios are realizing that the streaming model doesn't really work. It doesn't actually get in as much money, especially for productions like animation, as they expected. But there was a big boom a few years ago, so they overhired, and now the model's not working, and suddenly they need to cut off as many people as possible in order to survive.
Yeah, there was so much animation out there, all these big studios putting out massive things. And, I mean, as you said, it was also incredibly international, 102 countries participating. You experienced some of that international flavor in the various interviews that you did. What did you bring back for us?
Well, there was a lot to choose from, but I made a small selection for us. And the first thing we're going to hear from is a studio that made history. They're called Mano Animation Studios, and they have created Pakistan's first ever hand-drawn feature film called The Glassworker. And it's really a love letter to that form of animation, especially to directors like Hayao Miyazaki. And it took over 10 years to build, for them to build the studio and then make the film. And you're about to hear a little bit from its director and co-composer, Usman Riaz, producer Kaiser Riaz, and art director, Mariam Paracha.
The Glassworker is Pakistan's first hand-drawn independent feature film. No one in the country has ever attempted to make a film like this, and we're very, very grateful that we were able to pull it off.
There's no real film infrastructure in Pakistan. There is some, but it's not really big. There's none for 2D animation at all. It's not taught in schools. There's no production pipeline training or anything. So we had to come up with everything on the fly.
Yeah, similar to that. Like we came up with how to do it through like books, reading, and watching all these interviews, that how people did it, and I think that a lot of it had to do with just we were all so young when we were doing it, so we had that like passion and just grit to just keep going at it.
It is really interesting to hear how, we think of animation as this massive industry, and yet you go to a place like Pakistan and they basically had to start from scratch.
Yeah, that's right. And it took them a long, long time, and they really just had to do it through grit and determination. So it was very inspiring.
So what else did you bring from us around the world? I believe we're next heading to Hungary.
That's right. And this was probably personally my favorite film because it was a big surprise. This is an animated documentary which tells the story of when the Iron Curtain fell in Hungary and people were finally free to travel, but they didn't really have the money to travel. And so these three guys came up with this train ticket scheme, a fraud, where they were able to remove the ink and rewrite the destinations, and finally a whole generation of Hungarians could travel around the world. And here's the producer, Miklos Kazma, who's talking about why they took that very unconventional choice of making an animated feature film instead of a live-action documentary.
In the beginning, the idea when we did the recordings, it was for research. Laszlo started doing it as a feature film project, like a live-action, proper feature film. So this was more a research material. It says like, well, if you already have the real recording, why don't we edit it? And then you have this amazing animation style, why don't we recreate? So instead of like visually start to do live action recreation of scenes, why don't we recreate all that in animation?
It is very unique, isn't it? I mean, I love this story just about sort of the Cold War era train ticket scam out of Hungary, but also just, the fact that they used animation. You don't really see that from documentaries very much.
No, and the fact that they used it that way really turned the film into what feels more like a fiction film because they can tell it in this much more creative way and use all these crazy methods to tell it. So it was a really cool film.
All right, so clip number 3, we're going to head to the global south, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, that's right. So this year, UNESCO and Disney actually got together to sponsor this program by a company called Women in Animation, and the program's called Stories by Women, which wants to sort of provide support for women animation artists to gain access to the rest of the industry and get their projects funded. So they basically paid for all these women in primarily Africa, South America, and the Asia Pacific to come to the festival, meet mentors, course, meet funders and pitch their stories, which haven't started production properly, but they have the storyboards and that sort of thing. And to get you a sense of the kind of high energy and passion brought to the table by these artists, here's a clip of Brazilian director Camilla Padilha finishing up her pitch to a room full of producers and investors.
And we have come together to make this movie come true. But we also need you. We're looking for co-productions, distributions, international and national, and partners from all over the globe. You want to talk business? These are our contacts. And we are waiting for your call. Thank you so much.
I guess this goes to sort of both the passion of filmmakers in animation, or any films for that matter, but also the struggle of actually trying to get a film made. We need you. We need your participation.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. But I mean, you know, going back to that, like all the concerns around AI and the layoffs and all of this, I think for me, going to the festival, I found so many sources of optimism because so many new players are able to enter actually because of all these new technologies coming in part. And just to hear from one of those voices, this was an Emmy award-winning Spanish director by a film called Madrid Noir, which is a virtual reality film. So he's really invested in like new technologies and using them in interesting ways. And he's talking a bit about how he really doesn't think that the industry is under as much threat as you might think.
But the one thing that I can guarantee anyone that works in the industry in any position is that there has never been any cultural offshoot that has moved you that was not made by a human. Because the connection to anything that moved you, whether it's a song, a piece of clothing, a performance, or an animation or an illustration, a painting, whatever it is, you may think that it is because of the superficial aspects of that piece, the sound, the type of painting, the colors, but actually it is because in a very mystical way, and that's the beautiful thing of art, it is drawing a direct line between your experience as a human to another human's point of view.
That was James Castillo, the award-winning director of the virtual reality Madrid Noir. Just a final thought from you, Gunnar. I mean, what did you learn? The optimism, I suppose, that you felt there, but also the challenges at the same time. Is the industry in a good place?
I think that the industry is sort of in a bad place when it comes to those really massive studios like Disney, Pixar, Sony. This is where we're seeing all those massive layoffs. But if you look across the world, there's so many new players, and they're able to do this because of support systems like Kickstarter, just like consumers going directly to support these films, to people just having a wider appetite. I mean, the animation industry is no longer just this cartoon, child-oriented industry. There's so much variety, stuff for adults, stuff for people of all ages, and stuff from all countries.
Grown-up animation indeed. Gunnar Grunlund, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. And finally, on today's show, a little something to help you usher in cocktail hour this Friday evening. Art Basel is taking place this week in the Swiss border city. If you find that shopping for art has made you thirsty, head up to the Davide Campari Lounge. That is where, in collaboration with Magnum Photos, the British photographer Martin Parr has curated a special exhibition of images that celebrate bars and bar culture. Monocle's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs spoke to Martin Parr as well as the Galleria Campari curator, Anita Tedesco, to find out more. First of all, here's Anita.
This is concept reconceived from a show originally exhibited in Galleria Campari in Sesto San Giovanni, Milan, which is our corporate museum dedicated to the artistic legacy of the Campari brand, which was founded in Milan in 1860, which has always been very close to the art scene, decade after decade. By looking at these materials, which actually were never displayed before last year in Galleria Campari, we noticed that there were so many of these photos representing moments of community, of being together in the bar environment, in a very natural and spontaneous attitude and approach, where people got together to have a chat, to meet friends, to exchange ideas. It would have been great to show and tell the stories behind the bar world. Of course, this was quite an ambitious project. So we selected images from the Campari archive on this specific theme, and we partnered up with Magnum Photos to kind of widen the points of views actually, because the exhibition displays several of the most famous Magnum photographers, and this in Basel was reconceived specifically by Martin Parr for the Davide Campari Lounge in Art Basel.
Here we are at the exhibition that I curated with Campari, and it shows different images of bars and people drinking Campari. And I want to start by talking about this one up here, which is a scene from 1974. Apparently it's about the divorce law. So on the paper headline there, it's introduced, I guess, divorce into Italy, finally. But it's completely surrounded by litter, and people are still drinking through it. And then I'm going to choose one of mine over here. This is in Havana, and this is the bar associated with Hemingway. And people go in there, it's really packed. And you can see here there's a Japanese couple, and they're doing a selfie, which of course is something that is very prolific these days, of them in the bar. And you can see the barmaid behind there. And to the left is two guys, one of them with a classic sort of Hawaiian shirt, another one eating an olive or something like that. And over the years, I've always been attracted to going to bars. They're a great place to photograph, lots of people, lots of atmosphere. So yeah, I have a sort of tradition within my own archive of photographing bars, and it's nice to see this exhibition of Campari-based bar images. I guess I could have actually made a whole exhibition of my own pictures from bars, especially black and white. I photographed something called Yates's Wine Lodge. They're a very peculiar institution in northern England. They had 25 different bars, and they also sold sardines and tea because they believed in giving the working class things that are nice to eat. So I could have put that series in, but here, the thing about this wall that's quite striking is that they're in colour. Most of the pictures here in black and white. So I could have indeed gone from black and white into colour, because I guess I'm using colour with flash, so the pictures look a bit different. Previously with black and white, I was just photographing available light, which often in bars is very beautiful. So I think that sort of reflects how my work has changed and how it's developed, going from more sort of romantic black and white pictures. We've got one there, which is the one we're going to use for the poster, going through the colour pictures. Everything's rather bright and crazy, and you see here there's one from Tbilisi, one from Havana, and one from a village near Bristol. So I've been a photographer for over 50 years now. My grandfather was a very keen photographer, and he sort of passed the bug on to me. You know, he gave me a camera, went out taking pictures, processed them, made prints, and I decided from the age of 13 or 14, that's exactly what I wanted to do. If I look back, I think two things have happened in my life. First, the change from black and white to colour in the early 80s. And secondly, I'd say the introduction of the smartphone. I've done whole books of people doing selfies. You go to a bar now, everyone's taking selfies of everything. If you go to a restaurant, everyone's photographing the food on their plate. You can see here this picture in Havana. You know, the couple there are doing a selfie of them in the bar. So it's had a profound effect on the whole world we live in. Maybe not for the better, because people tend to sort of not communicate as much. They tend to look at their screen far too much. But that's something I've tried to capture, because I want my work to sort of keep up to date rather than just be entirely nostalgic.
Martin Parr and Anita Todesco speaking with Sophie Monaghan-Coombs at the Davide Campari Lounge at Art Basel. And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my guests today, Andrew Muller, Julia Lasica, Alexis Self and Gunnar Grunlid. Today's show was produced by Laura Kramer. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. Goodbye and thanks for listening.